and the co-director of the program on international security policy at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. He graduated from West Point in 1970 and then served 5 years as an officer in the U.S. Air Force. He received his PhD in political science from Cornell University in 1980. He spent the 1979-1980 academic year as a research fellow at the Brookings Institution and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University Center for International Affairs from 1980 to 1982. During the 1998-99 academic year, he was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Professor Mearchierrmer has written extensively about security issues and international politics more generally. He has published 4 books: Conventional Deterrence in 1983, which won the Edgar S. Furness Jr. Book Award, Little Heart and the Weight of History in 1988, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001, which won the Joseph Lefkoe Book Prize. And in 2007, Professor Mearchierrmer co-authored with Harvard professor Stephen Walt The Israel Lobby and the U.S. Foreign Policy in 2007. When Noam Chomsky was asked by Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman about the book, Professor Chomsky replied, quote, "Professors Walt and Mearchierrmer deserve credit for publishing a study which they knew was going to elicit the usual streams of abuse and hysteria from supporters of Israeli crimes and violence. Try to say a sane and uncontroversial word about any other issue dear to the hearts of the intellectual elite that they've turned into Holy Writ, and you get the same reaction." Professor Mearchierrmer has also written many articles that have appeared in academic journals like International Security and popular magazines like the London Review of Books. Furthermore, he has written a number of op-ed pieces for the New York Times dealing with topics like Bosnia, nuclear proliferation, American policy towards India, the failure of Arab-Israeli peace efforts, and the folly of invading Iraq. Please welcome Professor Mearchierrmer.
I'd like to thank the committee for a just peace in Israel and Palestine for inviting me to come to Oak Park to speak. And I would like to thank all of you for turning out on a beautiful fall afternoon here at the library. I'm going to talk about the Israel lobby and its influence on the presidential candidates, as well as the influence it's sure to have on the winner once he moves into the White House. I will argue that the lobby has had a profound influence on how both John McCain and Barack Obama have talked about Israel during the campaign, and it will have a profound influence on how the new president acts towards Israel over the next 4 years. Specifically, the lobby puts enormous pressure on presidential candidates and presidents to maintain America's special relationship with Israel, because it believes that singling out Israel for special treatment is good for both the United States and Israel. As we have seen during the 2008 campaign, the candidates comply with the lobby's demands, and indeed they end up competing to show who's Israel's best friend and who loves Israel more. The truth, however, is that neither Barack Obama nor John McCain is a friend of Israel. The special relationship which the lobby pushes and they embrace is a bad policy for both countries, and especially for Israel. It would be much better for the Jewish state if the United States abandoned the special relationship and treated Israel as a normal country, the way it treats other democracies like Britain, France, Germany, and India. That will not happen because the lobby insists on maintaining the special relationship, and the candidates have little choice but to do what the lobby wants if they hope to get elected. I would like to proceed by first defining what Steve Walt and I mean by the term Israel lobby, and then describe the special relationship which the lobby has worked so hard to promote. I will then make the case that the lobby is a remarkably powerful interest group and show how it has influenced the presidential election. Then I will explain why the special relationship is in neither America's nor Israel's national interest. I will conclude by explaining what I mean when I say that the United States should treat Israel as a normal country. What exactly is the Israel lobby? It's a loose coalition of individuals and groups who work openly to influence U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. It is not a centralized organization, and the groups that make up the lobby do not agree on every issue. It includes organizations like AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Zionist Organization of America, and Christians United for Israel, just to name a few. It also includes think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and publications like the Weekly Standard and the New Republic. This is a broad definition, but most special interest groups have different components. The environmental movement, for example, is not just Greenpeace or the Sierra Club. It also includes research groups, sympathetic local organizations, academics, and journalists, just like the pro-Israel movement does. It certainly is not a cabal or a conspiracy that controls U.S. foreign policy. Rather, it is an especially powerful interest group like the NRA, the Farm Lobby, the Cuban Lobby, or the American Association of Retired People. And it operates the same way that other interest groups do. Its actions, as Steve and I like to say, are as American as apple pie. Very importantly, the lobby is not synonymous with Jewish Americans. Surveys suggest that about 1/3 of American Jews do not care that much about Israel. Others do not support the lobby's positions, and some groups that work on Israel's behalf, such as the so-called Christian Zionists, are not Jewish. In short, the lobby is defined by its political agenda, not by ethnicity or religion. The lobby also does not include individuals who simply have a favorable attitude toward Israel. Rather, one has to actively work to try to shape U.S. policy in a pro-Israel direction. Obviously, some groups and individuals are more active and influential than others, although there is no question that overall, the lobby has gotten the relationship between the United States and Israel that it desired. To put it succinctly, the United States has a special relationship with Israel that has no parallel in American history. Indeed, as the late Yitzhak Rabin once said, U.S. support for Israel is beyond compare in modern history. What makes the relationship between America and Israel special is the sheer amount of support that we give Israel and the fact that we give it unconditionally. The Jewish state is the largest recipient of U.S. economic and military aid, about $500 per year per Israeli, even though it is a prosperous country with a per capita income that the World Bank ranks 27th in the world. Since the end of World War II, Israel has received more foreign aid from Washington than any other country. Israel also gets consistent diplomatic backing from the United States. We almost always take Israel's side in regional disputes. For example, since 1972, the United States has vetoed 42 UN security resolutions that were critical of Israel, which is greater than the combined total of all the vetoes cast by the other Security Council members in the same period. Most importantly, however, that aid is given unconditionally. In other words, Israel gets this aid even when it does things that the United States opposes, like building settlements in the occupied territories. Furthermore, Israel is rarely ever criticized by U.S. officials, and certainly not by anyone who aspires to high office. Almost all of our critics acknowledge that there is a lobby, but they either argue that it is not very powerful, or that Steve Walt and I are saying it is all powerful and it controls U.S. Middle East policy. To be clear, we explicitly say that the lobby is not all powerful and that it does not control U.S. Middle East policy. Instead, we argue that it is very powerful and has a marked or profound influence on American foreign policy. Indeed, when you look carefully at the evidence, there is little doubt that the Israel lobby is an especially powerful interest group, which again is perfectly legitimate. Consider AIPAC, which is just one of the many organizations in the lobby, although surely the most influential one. AIPAC was ranked number 2 in a 2005 National Journal survey of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, and ranked 2nd in the 1997 survey by Fortune magazine. Former President Bill Clinton said that AIPAC was better than anyone else lobbying in this town. And Newt Gingrich, who rarely agrees with Bill Clinton about anything, said it was, quote, the most effective general interest group across the entire planet. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said, quote, there is no group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. Former Senator Fritz Holland said, as he left office, quote, you can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you. Stephen Rosen, the AIPAC official who is now under indictment for passing classified information, once put a napkin in front of Jeffrey Goldberg, a journalist from the New Yorker, and said, quote, in 24 hours we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin. And Goldberg, who wrote one of the most vicious reviews of our book, calls AIPAC, quote, a leviathan among lobbies. Speaking of our critics, I might note that Alan Dershowitz said, that, quote, quoting Alan Dershowitz, my generation of Jews became part of what is the most effective lobbying and fundraising effort in the history of democracy, end of quote. Thus, it is hardly surprising that outgoing Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said just last year, thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world. And again, AIPAC is just one part of the Israel lobby. The lobby's influence has been on display throughout the 2008 presidential campaign, with both presidential and vice presidential candidates going out of their way to express their support for Israel. Shmuel Rosner, a hardline columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, summed up the situation nicely when he wrote earlier this month, quote, loving Israel and making it known time and time again is still a litmus test for any American politician. Barely can a presidential debate go by without the mentioning of this tiny country in a distant region. Last week, in the vice presidential debate, Israel's name was mentioned 17 times. China was mentioned twice, Europe just once. Russia didn't come up at all. Nor did Britain, France, or Germany. The only two countries to get more attention were Iraq and Afghanistan, the countries in which U.S. forces are fighting wars. And the Biden-Palin debate was not the exception, but the rule, end of quote. In fact, pandering to Israel in the campaign has gotten so out of hand that it has led to clever and much talked about spoofs on Saturday Night Live and Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. What makes these spoofs so amazing is that they poke fun at the special relationship, something that is hardly ever done in the mainstream media in the United States. The pandering has also led some of Israel's strongest supporters to worry out loud about all the attention Israel is getting in the race for the White House. For example, the Rosner piece that I just quoted from is titled, "Enough About Israel Already." Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a piece for his Atlantic monthly blog, which was also entitled, "Enough About Israel Already." And in it he said that, quote, "If neither presidential candidate nor vice presidential candidate mentioned Israel between now and the election, I wouldn't mind at all." Finally, M.J. Rosenberg of the Israel Policy Forum, who's one of Israel's wisest supporters here in the United States, complained last week that, quote, "pandering to Jewish voters," end of quote, has gotten out of hand, and that it's due largely to the pressure from key organizations. It is important to recognize, however, that there is a reason why these pro-Israel organizations demand that politicians and policymakers constantly pledge their allegiance to Israel and the special relationship. It is because that policy makes no sense for the United States. If it was a wise policy, hardly anyone would have any reason to question it, and thus there would be no need to push politicians and policymakers to endorse it so often. But that's not the case. The special relationship does not serve America's interests, nor does it serve Israel's interests. There are two reasons why it's a misguided policy. First, Israel's interests, like any other country's interests, are not always the same as America's. Thus, it makes little sense for the United States to back Israel no matter what it does, because sometimes there will be circumstances where the interests of the two countries clash. For example, it made good strategic sense for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons in the 1960s, given that it lived in a dangerous neighborhood and a nuclear arsenal is the ultimate deterrent. But it was not in America's interest for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons, which is why the United States went to some lengths to stymie Israel's nuclear program. Second, Israel is a normal country, and as such, it sometimes pursues smart policies and sometimes pursues foolish policies. Most of us here tonight are Americans, and we love our country. But at the same time, we understand that it sometimes adopts ill-advised policies. Just look at what has happened in Iraq over the past 5 years. Israel is no different than the United States. Indeed, no country has ever pursued a flawless foreign policy, and none ever will. Given that basic fact of life, would it not make sense for the United States to be able to publicly criticize Israel and pressure it when it pursues misguided policies, and support Israel when it pursues smart ones? But that is not how the special relationship works. It requires American leaders to support Israel even when it adopts a wrong-headed policy. It is hard to see, for me, how this situation makes good sense for the United States, much less Israel. Let me expand on these problems, the special relationship, by explaining how they hurt both countries in two concrete cases. I'll start with the United States and argue their support for Israel's policies in the occupied territories is one of the major causes, and I want to underline that I'm saying that it's one of the major causes of our terrorism problem, and it is not likely to go away anytime soon. It has been the official policy of every president since 1967 to oppose the building of settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And that includes President George W. Bush, who has made repeated requests to the Israelis to halt settlement building. Yet, because of the special relationship, no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements and, in effect, colonizing those territories. Just to show you how serious this problem is, consider what the Israelis did in the occupied territories between the signing of the Oslo Accords in September 1993 and the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000. During that 7-year period, when the Clinton administration was committed to creating a viable Palestinian state and finally settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel confiscated 40,000 acres of Palestinian land, built 250 miles of connector and bypass roads, doubled the number of settlers, and built 30 new settlements. President Clinton, like his predecessors and his successor, did not use America's considerable leverage to halt this building spree. In fact, the Clinton administration effectively supported Israel's actions by protecting it from criticism at the United Nations, giving it more foreign aid than any other country, and giving that aid unconditionally. Of course, that is what the special relationship demands. Nevertheless, Israel's policies in the occupied territories are not in America's national interest, which is why every president since Lyndon Johnson has opposed the settlements. To be more specific, there is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence which shows that U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories, angers, if not enrages, a substantial number of people in the Arab and Islamic world. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize again that I am not saying that America's support for Israel's policies toward the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I am simply saying it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment tool for terrorist organizations, and it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab world. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's harsh treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It is commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently, and he only cares because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events on September 11th had nothing to do with Israel. And three, those involved in the attacks hated us because of who we are, not our Middle East policies. For example, Robert Sattler from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy claims that bin Laden's identification with the Palestinians is, quote, a recent and almost surely opportunistic phenomenon, end quote. While former Middle East negotiator Dennis Ross maintains that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that this attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians. These claims, however, are simply not true. It is clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the Palestinians' dire situation since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in his public statements throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, wrote in a review of 2 books about bin Laden, one of which was a compilation of his speeches. Quote, "Of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches." Regarding the actual attacks on 9/11, we know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major reason we were hit that fateful day. It was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that the attackers struck Congress because he saw it as the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also tells us that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attacks because of events involving Israel, even though doing so would have increased the risk of failure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it identifies correctly as the principal architect of the attacks. To quote the Commission report, "By his own account, KSM's animus toward the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel." It's hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role that U.S. support for Israel played in inspiring the 9/11 attacks. In short, the special relationship between Jerusalem and Washington is helping to fuel America's terrorism problem. Let me now turn to Israel and focus on U.S. support for Israel's policies in the occupied territories. I will address a simple question. Has that support, which clearly derives from the special relationship, been in Israel's interest? Or would it have been better for Israel if the United States had pressured it to stop building settlements and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state? As things now stand, it is hard to see how there can be a meaningful two-state solution. The root of the problem is that the Israelis control large portions of the West Bank, and they showed little interest in giving that land to the Palestinians. To be specific, there is little public support, not to mention elite support in Israel, for the famous Clinton parameters of December 2000, which are the only realistic bases for creating a viable Palestinian state. And there is little reason to think that this situation is going to change anytime soon. The United States is certainly not going to put pressure on Israel to leave the West Bank as long as the special relationship is in place. Israel will therefore continue building roads and settlements on the West Bank, while the United States continues to support it unconditionally. This discussion raises the obvious question: what does Israel's future look like in the absence of separate Jewish and Palestinian states living side by side? Given present circumstances, there are 3 possible alternatives, all of which involve creating a greater Israel, which means an Israel that effectively controls both the West Bank and Gaza. In the first scenario, Greater Israel could become a democratic binational state in which both Palestinians and Israeli Jews enjoy equal political rights. This solution has been suggested by a handful of Jews and a growing number of Palestinians. practical obstacles to this option are daunting, however, and binational states do not have an encouraging track record. Moreover, this option means abandoning the original Zionist vision of a Jewish state, since the Palestinians would eventually outnumber the Jews in Greater Israel. There is little reason to think that Israel's Jewish citizens would voluntarily accept this solution, and one can also safely assume that Israel's supporters in America would have virtually no interest in this outcome. Second, Israel could expel most of the Palestinians from Greater Israel, thereby preserving the Jewish character of Israel through an overt act of ethnic cleansing. Although a few Israeli hardliners have advocated variants on this approach, to do so would be a crime against humanity, and no genuine friend of Israel could support such a heinous course of action. It is worth noting that there are almost 5.2 million Palestinians in the lands that would comprise Greater Israel, and they would surely put up fierce resistance if Israel tried to expel them from their homes. If this is what opponents of a two-state solution are advocating, they should say so explicitly. This form of ethnic cleansing would not end the conflict, however. It would merely reinforce the Palestinians' desire for vengeance and strengthen those extremists who still oppose Israel's existence. The final alternative, which is the most likely, is some form of apartheid, whereby Israel continues to increase its control over the occupied territories, but allows the Palestinians to exercise limited autonomy in a set of disconnected and economically crippled statelets. Israelis and their American supporters invariably bristle at the comparison to white rule in South Africa, but that is the future they face if they try to incorporate the occupied territories into Israel while denying full political rights to an Arab population that will soon outnumber the Jewish population in the entirety of the land. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said as much when he recently proclaimed that, quote, if the two-state solution collapses, Israel will face a South Africa-style struggle. I want to repeat that because it's not John Mearchierrmer or Steve Walker or Jimmy Carter who's making that statement. It is Prime Minister Ehud Olmert of Israel who is saying, in effect, that if we don't have a two-state solution, and we're not going to get a two-state solution, we're going to end up in a South Africa-like situation, which means an apartheid state. Again, if the two-state solution collapses, Israel will face a South African-style struggle. He went so far, Olmert that is, went so far as to argue that, quote, as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished, end of quote. Similarly, Israel's vice prime minister said earlier this year that, quote, the occupation is a threat to the existence of Israel. Other Israelis, as well as Jimmy Carter and Bishop Desmond Tutu, have warned that continuing the occupation will turn Israel into an apartheid state. Of course, the apartheid option is not a viable long-term solution either, because it is morally repugnant, and because the Palestinians will continue to resist until they get a state of their own. This situation will force Israel to escalate the repressive policies that have already cost it significant blood and treasure, encouraged political corruption, and badly tarnished its global image. Thus, these three possibilities are the only alternatives to a two-state solution, and no one who wishes Israel well should be enthusiastic about any of them. Thus I ask, would it not have been better for Israel if the United States had long ago pressured it to stop building settlements and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state? But this did not happen, and it will not happen, because the special relationship makes it impossible for American leaders to use the leverage at their disposal to bring this tragic conflict to an end. Let me conclude with a brief word about what I think the new president should do over the next 4 years with regard to the U.S.-Israeli relationship. To start, he should end the special relationship and treat Israel as a normal country. As I emphasized at the start of my talk, the United States should treat Israel the same way it treats other democracies around the world. In practice, this means that when Israel is acting in ways that are consistent with American interests, Washington should back the Jewish state. But when Israel is acting in ways that harm U.S. interests, Washington should distance itself from Israel and use its considerable leverage to get it to change its behavior, just as it would do with any other country that was acting in ways that might hurt the United States. Regarding Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, the United States should act as an honest broker. In other words, Washington should pursue an even-handed policy toward the two sides. In particular, the United States should make it clear to Israel that it must abandon the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state on those lands. Jerusalem should be told that the United States will oppose, not tolerate, its colonial expansion in the West Bank. None of this is to say that the new administration should abandon Israel. On the contrary, the United States should defend Israel's right to exist within its pre-1967 borders with some minor modifications. And most importantly, if Israel's survival is threatened, the United States should come to its aid. But you know, and I know, the United States is not going to treat Israel as a normal country, because the lobby will insist on maintaining the special relationship. Both John McCain and Barack Obama have demonstrated throughout the campaign they are not about to challenge the lobby on this critically important issue, which means that Israel will continue down the apartheid road, and America's terrorism problem will not go away anytime soon. In short, a bad situation is only going to get worse, regardless of who occupies the White House after January 2009. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Much, Dr. Mearchierrmer. I'll make a few announcements, and while I'm doing that, there are two of my colleagues circulating cards around the audience for those of you who would like to submit questions. We've found in our experience that written questions are by far the most effective way, so that when you ask a question, it doesn't have to be restated so that the entire group can hear it. So submit your questions in written form, and I'll read them from here, and then Dr. Mearchierrmer can answer them. A few announcements, two upcoming events. Becca already referred to these. Between October 25 and 27, there will be 3 days of events, timed to synchronize with the APAC National Summit that's being held here in Chicago. Information about that is on the table near the door where you entered. Our next event is happening Saturday, November 15th. Diana Butu and Eddie Makue. Again, information on the back desk. The main thing I want to talk to you about is to express my gratitude that we are here in our 7th year as an organization. And I say that out of a sense of profound gratitude and respect for my colleagues who are part of this organization, that we have succeeded in outlasting considerable odds as an organization doing this difficult work, and to say what an important part of that work is the contributions we get from our supporters. So we've tried to make it convenient. At the table, you'll find donation cards and envelopes that allow us to both stay in touch with you by mail and email, and also for you to send us your expression of support for the importance of the work we do as we build it into future years. In a moment, feel free to stand up, stretch your legs briefly. There's a little bit of water and fewer cookies than there are people at the back table. Also take the opportunity, if you wish, to buy a book, and Professor Mearchierrmer will be signing them after the show. We'll take a brief break, and then we'll reassemble for question and answer in about 4 minutes. Thank you. We've got this powerful lobby. How can we save our country from destruction by special interest group? You paint such a hopeless picture. You say it's not likely to change, so what's a citizen to do? What can concerned American citizens do to avoid the dire spiral? What can we as Americans do to stop the effect? You get the picture. So I'm going to pass you the microphone, and you can talk about that while I sort through this other line of
I think that there are basically two things that can be done to hopefully improve this situation. Number one is that if more and more people push this into the open, and we get to a situation where
backlighting for the camera, so sorry.
can I put this in here and just talk up here? Let me start all over, okay? I don't think that there's going to be any significant change in American policy over the next 4 years. In that sense, I'm pessimistic. But I'm optimistic about the long term for 2 reasons. First is I do believe that the discourse is beginning to change and will change more and more with the passage of time. I think it will become increasingly possible to talk about Israel in a critical way, U.S.-Israeli relationship in a critical way, and the lobby itself in a critical way in the mainstream media. And I would encourage people to do everything they can to help speed up that change in our discourse. I think one of the key reasons that this is happening is that because of the internet, it is now possible for people to get information about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, that was almost impossible to get in the past. As I was just saying to somebody, if you think about our article, the article that Steve and I originally wrote on the Israel lobby, we were commissioned to write it by the Atlantic Monthly, and it eventually was rejected by the Atlantic. And we could not find, by the summer of 2005, any outlet in the United States where we could publish the article. So after a good 3 years' worth of work, we decided to just put it in the closet and forget about it. The truth is that in August 2005, we thought that the piece would just never see the light of day, and we would move on to other topics. And this was just a failed enterprise. And then, fortunately, someone at the Atlantic gave an American scholar a copy of the original manuscript that we had delivered to the Atlantic. And this American scholar saw it, liked it, and put us on to the London Review of Books, where it was eventually published. But the key point that I wanted to make to you is that all we needed from the London Review of Books was a link that included that piece, right? Once there's a link on the internet for that London Review of Books piece, people all over the world can read it. Before the internet, how many people would have read that piece in the London Review of Books? Maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000, not that many people. But with the internet, it was possible to ricochet that piece all over the world almost instantaneously. I read Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, 2 or 3 times a day. I read the Jerusalem Post. I read all sorts of other websites in Israel. I read the Al Jazeera website. I watch news from BBC. I watch news from Al Jazeera. And this means that more and more people are thinking about and talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in what I would call sophisticated and honest ways. Just give you another example to highlight this. As you know, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of Israel's founding in May of this year. Israel was founded in May 1948, and obviously in May 2008, we've had the 60th anniversary. If you looked at the media coverage of Israel's founding, there was all sorts of discussion of what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. And in fact, the word Nakba was used for the first time. If you go back to 1998, which is the 50th anniversary of the founding of Israel, there was hardly any attention paid in the mainstream media to what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. And the word Nakba was simply absent from the discourse. The discourse is changing in a fundamental way. And by the way, it's Israeli historians who have played the key role in shifting the discourse. But the discourse is beginning to change. I talked about the Saturday Night Live skit on Sarah Palin that poked fun at her comments about Israel. For those of you who haven't seen the Jon Stewart clip on the lobby at the time of AIPAC's annual conference, you should go home and Google it. It's a truly amazing piece. The fact that Jon Stewart was willing to say those things would have been unheard of 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Now, another point on this, since it is such an important question. One of the reasons it's possible to change the discourse is because this situation is disastrous for the United States, for Israel, and for the Palestinians. The present trajectory that we're on is a lose-lose trajectory. It's just hard to believe that we haven't moved to fix this situation. Again, listen to what Ehud Olmert says. Ehud Olmert understands that the present trajectory that Israel is on is tantamount to driving a car off a cliff. If you don't get a 2-state solution, you end up with an apartheid state, or maybe massive expulsion. This would be an unmitigated disaster. It is in Israel's interest to put an end to this conflict and allow the Palestinians to have a real state. And it's certainly in the Palestinians' interest. I don't have to say more on that. And it's in America's interest too. So given that structural environment, given that set of incentives, and given the internet, I think the discourse is going to change. It's going to be increasingly difficult to defend the special relationship. I would ask you in the audience, most of us are old enough to have witnessed quite a few presidential debates. Have you ever seen a presidential debate where Israel was discussed more than the 2008 election? I don't think there's anything like this in the past. And the reason is that there are more and more doubters out there about the relationship, about the policies that Israel is pursuing and the policies that we are pursuing with regard to Israel and the Palestinians. There are more and more doubters. And given that situation, the lobby feels compelled to put more and more pressure on the candidates to say all the time that they love Israel and they'll defend the special relationship. That's my first reason for optimism. My second reason for optimism mainly has to do with the American Jewish community. My sense is that increasing numbers of people in the American Jewish community are coming to recognize that the present situation is not good for Israel. And as a result, they're beginning to raise questions about AIPAC's policy preferences. And some American Jews are even this new lobby organization that's been established by a handful of American Jews. J Street is a response to this tragic situation that I described, that Mearchierrmer described, and that increasing numbers of people are beginning to recognize. I often say to people that when our article came out and then when our book came out, many people argued that not only were we anti-Semites, we were enemies of Israel. And of course, people like Barack Obama and John McCain are the real friends of Israel. And Jimmy Carter, for that matter, is more or less the ultimate enemy of Israel. I think nothing is further from the truth. That was the point that I tried to make here. Jimmy Carter is a friend of Israel. Jimmy Carter is not an anti-Semite. It's ludicrous for Martin Peretz to say that he will go down in history as a Jew hater. Whatever you think of Jimmy Carter as a politician, he's a fundamentally decent man who has Israel's best interests at heart. This is not to say that people can't disagree with Jimmy Carter, but he has Israel's best interests at heart. And in fact, what Jimmy Carter said was essentially what Mearchierrmer said. Jimmy Carter is a real friend of Israel. Barack Obama and John McCain are not real friends of Israel because they will give Israel unconditional support. And Israel does not need unconditional support. Not because we want to punish Israel or be mean to Israel, because it's not in Israel's interest. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that there is no state in the history of the world, and there never will be a state that conducts a perfect foreign policy. States sometimes pursue foolish policies, and they sometimes pursue smart policies. And the Jewish state is no exception in this regard. And it does not make any sense to support Israel when it pursues foolish policies. It's not good for Israel. And again, back to this situation, it's not good for Israel, it's not good for the United States, and it is certainly not good for the Palestinians. And fixing the situation is a win-win-win situation. My argument here is that I do believe that increasing numbers of American Jews are coming to realize this. And I think that pressure will be brought to bear on organizations like AIPAC to change their views on settlements and on Israel's hardline policies more generally. And I think you'll see the appearance of more moderate and more reasonable organizations in the Israel lobby. You'll see more people like M.J. Rosenberg of the Israel Policy Forum coming to the fore, and hopefully they'll have an increased weight in the discourse. And I think if this happens, if we change the discourse, my first point, even more than it's already been changed, and two, if we can create a situation where more reasonable voices in the American Jewish community have increased political weight, that would be all for the good.
There are two clusters of questions. One has to do with the relationship between the Israel lobby and the decision of the United States to invade Iraq in 2003. And the second is the relationship between the Israel lobby and planning underway now to respond to Iran's actions and nuclear project.
Okay, these are two separate and big issues, so I'll take them in order. The first has to do with the lobby's role in causing the Iraq War, which of course Steve and I wrote about in our original article and in the book, and which is one of the most controversial aspects of the piece. And then second, I'll talk about the role of the lobby and the role of Israel in pushing the United States to countenance using military force to deal with the Iranian nuclear program. But first, with regard to Iraq. Our basic argument is that the lobby, and here we're talking mainly about the neoconservatives, were the main driving force behind the Iraq War. But by themselves, the neoconservatives could not make the war happen. Our argument is that it took the events of 9/11 and the conversion of Vice President Cheney and President Bush to the position that attacking Iraq was a good idea to make it happen. So to put it in social science terms, our argument is that the neoconservatives, and the lobby more generally, were a necessary but not sufficient condition for making the war happen. Now let me tell you the story. As you all remember, we went to war against Saddam Hussein in 1991, and we pushed him out of Kuwait. But we decided at that time, very wisely, not to go to Baghdad, because we understood what would happen if we did. We understood that what happened after 2003 would have happened after 1991, had we gone to Baghdad. In the early 1998 timeframe, early 1998, the neoconservatives began to push the Clinton administration to think about using military force to topple Saddam Hussein. They wrote 2 letters that were signed by a bevy of neoconservatives and others, calling for using military force to topple Saddam, were sent to President Clinton. They helped push the Iraq Liberation Act through Congress in 1998. Nevertheless, the neoconservatives could not convince the Clinton administration to use military force against Saddam Hussein. Along comes President Bush. As you all remember, he gets elected in November 2000 and he takes office in January 2001. President Bush and Vice President Cheney, in my opinion, showed no interest in using military force to topple Saddam Hussein during the 2000 campaign or during their first 8 months in office. There's all sorts of talk that Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill has produced evidence that they were committed to invading Iraq and they were just looking for the right time to do it. I can't go into the details here, but that's simply not true. In fact, Vice President Cheney was one of the key decision makers in 1991 who decided not to go to Baghdad for all the right reasons. Throughout the 1990s, he defended the decision not to go to Baghdad in 1991. He defended that decision during the campaign and immediately after the Bush administration took office. Indeed, Bill Kristol, a prominent neoconservative and one of the driving forces behind the war, said that when he heard that President Bush had nominated Vice President Cheney, or Richard Cheney, to be his vice presidential running mate, he, Bill Clinton, was sick. He, Bill Kristol, was sick to his stomach. Okay. So, from 1998 to January 2001, when President Clinton was in the White House, the conservatives were unable to push the United States to use military force to topple Saddam. And then, in the first 8 months of the Bush administration, they were unable to do the same. Then came 9/11. Now, there's no question that neoconservatives who occupied important positions in the White House, and many neoconservatives outside of the White House as well, had close connections with President Bush and Vice President Cheney, helped convince Bush and Cheney that the war against Iraq made good sense. But the fact of the matter is, President Bush and Vice President Cheney decided to attack Iraq. And without their support, the war would have never happened. And nobody can argue, in my opinion, that either one of them is a member of the Israel lobby. So again, my point is, the neoconservatives, one of the core groups in the lobby, were the main driving force from 1998 forward, but they could not make the war happen by themselves. And what they needed was President Bush and Vice President Cheney to get on board. And that happened after September 11th. And once you had A plus B, you had the conflict. Now there's one other dimension to this that's very important to mention. Some people said that we argue that the neoconservatives were arguing for a war because they thought it was good for Israel, period. And they might have even thought it was good for Israel, but bad for the United States. But still have been willing to do it because they're so deeply committed to Israel. This is not what we argue. The neoconservatives basically believe that America's interests and Israel's interests are one and the same. And they believe that what is good for Israel is good for the United States, and what is good for the United States is good for Israel. Steve and I disagree with that, as I pointed out to you in my former presentation. No two states have the same interests all the time. And that's true of Israel and the United States. That's not the way neoconservatives and most supporters of Israel think. They believe that what's good for Israel is good for the United States. So I believe neoconservatives were pushing a war against Iraq they thought was good for both countries. Unfortunately, they were dead wrong. One other dimension to this whole story about the Iraq War. People will often say, John, you and Steve say in the book that Israel helped support this war. And it was Israel working with the lobby that really was critical for making the Iraq War happen. But that's wrong, because Israel really wanted the United States to attack Iran, not Iraq. And that's the second issue we'll get to in a second. But let me just say a few words about that. When the Israelis first got wind that we were thinking seriously about invading Iraq in early 2002. Remember, we looked like we'd won a stunning victory in Afghanistan by December 2001. We think that at the time that we won a stunning victory in Afghanistan in December 2001. And then in early 2002, talk is beginning to surface into thinking about attacking Iraq. The Israelis are upset to hear this news. And they send a delegation to Washington to make it clear to the Bush administration they will prefer that they go after Iran rather than Iraq. What happens is that the Bush administration and the neoconservatives convince the Israelis that we do not simply intend to topple the regime in Iraq. We intend to topple regimes in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and maybe even Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East. Remember, the Bush administration was talking about toppling regimes across the entire region and turning the Middle East into a sea of democracies. So, the Bush administration made it clear to the Israelis that once we were finished with Saddam, we'd deal with Damascus and we'd deal with Tehran. So after that point, the Israelis were on board for an attack against Baghdad. In fact, they became staunch supporters of an attack against Saddam Hussein, and they pushed the United States very hard, but at the same time constantly reminding us that we had to do Iran after we did Iran. From the perspective of 2008, this may sound ludicrous, but as you remember, in the run-up to the war, and in the first few months after the war, after March 2003, most Americans thought that we had won a stunning victory. At that point in time, we thought we were Godzilla. We thought we were a Godzilla that could float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And the only interesting question was who was next on the target list. That's the way we were thinking then. And the Israelis foolishly bought that line of argument. They thought, as did the Bush administration, as did the neoconservatives, that we were on a roll. They were wrong, and they have suffered the consequences. But again, I want to emphasize to you that our argument is that the lobby is the principal driving force, but by itself could not make the war happen. Now that brings us to Iran. As I said to you, there's no question that the Israelis have long considered Iran to be a more serious threat than Iraq, which is not to say they didn't consider Saddam a threat. They just thought Iran was the threat for the obvious reason that Iran was racing down the nuclear road and Iraq, despite all the bad intelligence, was not. Now, if you look at what's happened over the past 5 years with regard to Iran in this country, in the United States, it's quite clear that the Israel lobby and Israel itself are the two principal driving forces pushing us to use military force against Iran. Israel is the only country in the world that is arguing we should use military force against Iran. Tell me what other country out there is enthusiastic about the military option. The answer is none. Talk about what's happening inside the United States. I have a clipping file that's about that thing that makes it perfectly clear that it is the lobby that is pushing hard for the military option. Hardly any other institution or group of people in the United States are enthusiastic about using military force against Iran. This is not to say that the U.S. government or most people in the national security establishment don't care about Iranian nuclear weapons. On the contrary, whether Israel was pushing or not wouldn't matter for us. We would be deeply concerned, independent of Israel, about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. However, there is little enthusiasm for making that happen with military force. Again, it is the lobby, and Israel itself that have been pushing us. And I believe that if you took that pressure away, there would be little talk in this country about using military force against Israel. Again, about that, Americans are allowed to have multiple loyalties. Americans are allowed to have dual loyalties. You can be an Irish citizen and an American citizen, and you can love Ireland and love America. You can be an Israeli citizen and an American citizen, and you can love both countries. That is perfectly acceptable in our political system. You can serve in the American military if you want. You can serve in the IDF if you want. You can serve in both of them if you want. That is the way things work in America. So when I say that Dennis Ross is deeply attached to Israel, that he feels a powerful attachment, I'm not accusing him in any way, shape, or form of doing anything wrong. I think it's almost impossible to deny that powerful sense of attachment that he feels. For those of you who haven't read Aaron David Miller's book, on his experiences as a Middle East negotiator, I would encourage you to go out and read the book. I think it's a truly excellent book, except for the occasional swipes that it takes at us. But Aaron David Miller is famous for making the argument that Dennis Ross and Miller himself basically acted as, and this is Miller's phrase, Israel's lawyers when they were working for the Clinton administration in the 1990s. Dennis Ross is, in my opinion, not someone who should be formulating U.S. Middle East policy, simply because he's just too attached to one side in that conflict. Now, with regard to the Washington Institute, I mean, the Washington Institute was set up by staunch supporters of Israel. It was set up in part by Martin Indyk, who had previously worked for AIPAC, and is also deeply committed to Israel. The Washington Institute goes to great lengths, as you would expect, to convince people that it is an objective, policy-neutral research institute in Washington. But this is simply not true. It's part and parcel of the lobby, and it's filled with people whose basic goal in life is to
of three of them. When you refer to Israel as a Jewish state, don't you delegitimize the 20% of Israel's population that is not Jewish? Is it not an oxymoron that Israel calls itself a democratic country, but yet holds an entire race, nation of people under brutal occupation? In your work, you draw a clear distinction between your criticism of Israel's actions and policies in the occupied territories on the one hand, and on the other hand, your support of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state within its green line. Should not you and others be willing and able to treat Israel as a normal country in criticizing its fundamentally anti-democratic treatment of its Palestinian minority within the green line?
I don't know how to answer those questions because there's so many of them. I mean, can we boil it down to maybe one or two questions? Maybe you want me to do it. I mean,
Let's take this one then. You draw a distinction in your work between your criticism of Israel's actions toward the occupation as opposed, and your staunch support of Israel's existence as a democracy within the green line. And yet, one might rightly criticize Israel for its anti-democratic actions within the green line. In other words, discuss the tension between Israel's self-identification as a Jewish state and a democratic state.
this is a very complicated subject, and there are usually two sets of arguments that are made about why America supports Israel along the lines in the question. One is because Israel is a democracy like the United States, and the other is that Israel is a state that shares our values. Those are two separate arguments. And let me deal with them in order. First of all, the argument that Israel shares our values is in part true. There's no question that we have certain values in common. But at its essence, Israel doesn't share our values because Israel is a Jewish state, and it is a Jewish state in theory and in practice. By definition, it discriminates against non-Jews, and it discriminates in favor of Jews. That's what being a Jewish state is all about. The United States of America is not a Christian state. The United States of America is a liberal state. We go to enormous lengths to try not to discriminate against people because of their religion or because of their ethnicity. We are very much a melting pot society. And all you have to do is look at what's happening in the United States with all this immigration to see how true that is. So the idea that we have something in common with Israel because it is a Jewish state, I think is simply wrong. This is not to say that there's anything wrong with having a Jewish state. I actually don't believe that. Okay? But I don't think that is the American way of doing business. I would also point out that when you talk about common values, when I see what the Israelis did in Lebanon in the summer of 2006, and when I see what they're doing to the Palestinians in the occupied territories, I say to myself, this has absolutely nothing to do with my values, and I think it doesn't have much to do with the values of most Americans. So I think that the argument that we share common values when we begin to parse it falls apart for the most part. What about the argument that Israel is a democracy? I do think it is a democracy, and I think it's a democracy that discriminates against the minority of Palestinian Arabs who live in its midst. It's probably about 20% of the population. They are clearly second-class citizens. The Israelis put together a commission, the Orr Commission, that studied this matter in the early part of this decade, and the Orr Commission came to the straightforward conclusion that the Palestinians were second-class treated as second-class citizens. Something had to be done to rectify that problem. My response in defense of Israel would be that this all basically tells me that Israel is a flawed democracy, and as such, it should be criticized. I'm not arguing that it's okay for Israelis to discriminate against the Palestinians who live inside the Green Line. I don't believe that for 1 second. I think it would be in Israel's interest to treat them much better. I mean, relations between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs would improve. Instead, they're actually getting worse, as most of you know from the recent conflict in Asia. This is not a good situation. But nevertheless, I think Israel is in many ways a vibrant democracy. But at the same time, I think it is a flawed democracy and deserves to be criticized. You understand that when we talk about Israel becoming an apartheid state, we're really talking about how Israel treats the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories. There are really sort of two groups of Palestinians here. One of the Palestinians who live inside Israel. There, I would not argue that you're headed towards an apartheid state, but if you talk about the Palestinians who live in the occupied territories, then you're talking about an apartheid state. One other point on this, if you look around the world, you'll see many states which are democratic, which nevertheless aspire to be dominated by one particular ethnic or religious group. I mean, just take a country like Japan, which is close ally of the United States. The Japanese have a very powerful sense that there are these people in the world called Japanese who should have their own state called Japan. And they're willing to tolerate some others living in their midst, mainly Koreans, but they don't want too many of the others because they want to maintain the Japanese nature of the state. Again, Japan is a democracy. It's not the way I like to do business, and I would assume it's not the way most of you like to do business. I like America because it's a multi-ethnic state. I like America. I love America because it's a melting pot. I love the fact that we don't discriminate against people because they're Jewish or because they're Catholic. It makes me sick to my stomach, to be perfectly frank. I hear people say that they won't vote for Barack Obama because they think he's a Muslim. Forget the question whether he's a Muslim or not. So what if he's a Muslim? You're not going to vote for him because he's a Muslim? This is not the way we're supposed to do business in America. We're a multi-ethnic state. Toleration is the name of the game. But that's not the way it works in Japan. And there are many other countries like that. I remember when I was a young boy, my mother, who had never spent a day in her life in Germany, but came from German roots. In fact, her father had been born in Germany in 1880 and came to the United States when he was 2 years old. But my mother told me that somebody had told her that she could go back to Germany and become a German citizen because she was considered to have German blood. And I remember thinking that you have all these Turks in Germany, right, who lived there for now 3 or 4 generations, who speak fluent German, who can't be considered real Germans because they're Turks. Whereas my mother, who speaks about 2 words of German, maybe Limburger cheese, and go back and become a German because it's in the blood. So, now, Germany is different than the United States. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, Germany and Japan, which have declining populations, are going to have to import significant numbers of people over time, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on that front, because they're not melting pots like the United States. We're a very special place. We're a very special place. And in being a very special place, we're actually very different from Israel. Israel is much more like Germany and Japan on this important issue. And for that reason, I'm less critical of the whole idea of the Jewish state than a lot of other people are. A lot of other people find that idea offensive because it's not a liberal state. But I can live with that, even though it's not my preferred way of doing business. The other point I would make is I would actually strongly support the existence of a Jewish state because of the history of anti-Semitism. I think that given all the horrible things that have been done to Jews over time, it's good that they have their own state. So I fully support the existence of a Jewish state. What I don't support is what they have been doing to the Palestinians, which I find reprehensible. And I feel towards the Palestinians the way I long have felt towards the Jews, that they need a state of their own so that they can protect themselves and live a decent and prosperous life. And this is why I think a two-state solution is the best way to solve this problem. I don't think we're going to get a two-state solution in a period of time. But I think it would be good if there was a Jewish state for the reasons I just said, and I think it would be good for the same reasons if there was a Palestinian state.
Let's do two more questions, and then we can break, and you can do some book signing. What is your position on the right of return of the Palestinian people pre-48 and 67? How has the Israel lobby worked to deny this claim of the Palestinian people?
I don't think the lobby has much to do with right of return. I think right of return is an issue for the Israelis to deal with and to decide what they're going to do. It's an issue that has to be worked out between the Israelis and the Palestinians. My view is that there's no way you can have a meaningful right of return, a real right of return, where the Palestinians actually come back to Israel and end up with a two-state solution. It's just not going to happen. Because it would mean the end of Israel. Huge numbers of Palestinians would come back inside the Green Line, and the balance of power would shift towards the Palestinian Arabs and away from the Israeli Jews. It just can't happen. And if you look at the Clinton parameters, which I said in my formal presentation, it is the only basis for settlement. Basically, what the Clinton parameters call for is finessing right of return. And I believe that Yasser Arafat fully understood that you would have to finesse right of return. I believe in talking to high-level Palestinian leaders that they understand that you have to finesse the right of return. I was in the West Bank in June. I talked to the Palestinian Prime Minister. I talked to the Palestinian Foreign Minister. I talked to Mahmoud Abbas's Chief of Staff and assorted other people. I believe that everybody understands that you can't have a full-scale right of return. It's just not going to work. Palestinians just don't want to give any ground on that issue now because it was bargaining leverage. That's why. These are smart people, and they've dealt with the Israelis long enough to know that the Israelis are not going to allow the right of return. Nevertheless, we have to work out some sort of arrangement that recognizes the principle and recognizes that something terrible happened to the Palestinians in 1948. It's very hard for many supporters of Israel in this country and for many Israelis to accept the fact that a crime had to be committed against the Palestinians to create the state of Israel. As I often say to the groups that I speak to, there was no way you could create a Jewish state in a sea of Arabs without doing terrible things to those Arabs. Just think about it. In 1880, there are very few Jews in what we eventually called Mandate Palestine. And then with the growth of Zionism in the late 1800s, Jews began to move in large numbers out of the Pale settlement in Europe into what becomes Mandate Palestine after World War I. Large numbers begin to move in, and of course, their basic objective is to hoped, they had originally hoped that huge numbers of Jews would leave Europe and come to Israel. But instead, what happened was huge numbers of Jews stayed in Russia and became key players in the Soviet Revolution in 1970 and in the Soviet Union. And huge numbers of Jews came to the United States of America. Most Jews in the Palace settlement between 1890 and 1924, that's when we shut the sluice gates in the United States on immigration. It's the first time we ever shut the sluice gates. It's really the only time. We reopened in 65. We shut the sluice gates in 24. Between 1890 and 1924, huge numbers of European Jews came to America. And Jews began to go to Palestine. That's when it happened. And again, do not want to underestimate the numbers that stayed in Russia. Okay? But what this meant was that not enough Jews came into Palestine so that they would eventually outnumber the Arabs. So they were going to have to ethnically cleanse the Arabs to create a Jewish majority. The Jews, the Zionists, they understood that from the beginning. And common sense tells you there was no other way to create a Jewish state. You had to do something terrible to the Palestinians. And of course, the Jewish leaders in Mandate Palestine said this on numerous occasions. They were very blunt about what they were doing. They were not happy about the fact they had to do that. These were not people who just wanted to go out and kill Palestinians because they didn't like Palestinians or take their homes away because they thought it was the just thing to do. They did it because they wanted to create a state. They felt that they needed a Jewish state. And of course, the imperative to do this became manifest after the Holocaust. But still, time was committed. But yet, it is so difficult for Israelis and for their supporters in this country to admit the terrible things were done to the Palestinians. And I think it's necessary to admit that, and it's necessary to have some sort of symbolic right of return to put this problem to bed. But in terms of having a real right of return, where Palestinians in huge numbers go back to their original homes, that's a deal breaker, without question.
This will be the last question, and then book signing will happen in that far corner of the room. Many of us here are aware of cases in which an individual speaking critically of Israel's actions and policies has seen their career truncated as a result. To what extent does your position as a tenured professor, closer to the end than to the beginning of your career, affect your willingness to speak out on this hazardous third rail of U.S. policy? We'll close with that.
This is a great question. I honestly love the question. Just a quick story before I talk about myself. I was involved in the Norman Finkelstein tenure decision with Paul. I was asked by Paul to write a tenure letter on Norman, who I know reasonably well. And I know his work extremely well. And I did write a tenure letter, and I followed the case very carefully. And I've actually given a couple of public speeches on the matter. Norman deserved tenure without question. This is not even interesting. It's not to say that I agree with everything Norman says. In fact, Norman has been very critical of our Israel lobby article and our Israel lobby book. It's gone around the country saying we were wrong. Nevertheless, I wouldn't hesitate to give him tenure. I also think he's a very fine person, not without his faults, but a very fine person at root. And I think the fact that he didn't get tenure is a tragedy, and I think it is manifestly clear that Norman did not get tenure because he is a thorn in the side of the lobby, and the lobby went to great lengths to prevent him from getting tenure.
I think Norman would have been much smarter to have waited until he had tenure before he took out after the lobby. In fact, Norman was a graduate student at Princeton when he got involved in what was known as the Joan Peters controversy and first tangled with the lobby. And he was in mortal combat with them from that point forward. In other words, Norman was fighting the lobby well before he got tenure. And it is not surprising, therefore, that he was denied tenure. According to myself, I'll tell you a quick story which gets at my views on this. When the Atlantic called me in November, they called me, I think, in October of 2002. They had gotten wind that I was doing something on the lobby, and they called me and asked me if I would write a piece on the subject of the title of the book. They said, would you write a piece on the Israel lobby in U.S. foreign policy? They said, we'd like to run a piece on that. They said, we know it's controversial, but we think we could do it, and you have an impeccable establishment reputation, and you're the guy to do it. I said to them, by the way, I not only had tenure, I was a chaired professor at the University of Chicago at that point in time. I'd been chair of my department. I was well established. I said to them that I won't do it alone. I said I have to find out whether Steve Wall, who was my buddy and who I've been talking to about this subject, is willing to do it with me. I told the gentleman at the Atlantic that I talked to that I did not think that I alone could withstand the firestorm. I thought it would just be too great to handle without having somebody in the foxhole next to me. And I remember very distinctly at the time reflecting on Norman, because I had seen what that had done to Norman at the time. As you can imagine, hopefully when you have had the experience I have, it can really be vicious. If you don't have somebody to talk to, you could end up, put it bluntly, psychologically damaged. So I told the people of the Atlantic I would do it, and I wouldn't do it alone. And so I called up Steve, and I asked him if he would do it. And I was actually surprised that he did it. He was the academic dean at the Kennedy School at the time, and many people thought that he had the capabilities to become a university provost or a university president, and there was no question that if he wrote this piece that would never happen. Many people also thought that he would be a national security advisor for someone like Barack Obama. I believe if Barack Obama, if we hadn't written the lobby article and the lobby book, that Steve would be one of Obama's principal advisors. He's a very smart man. He has very good judgment. He's a brilliant bureaucrat, and he would have risen far. In fact, just one quick story on this. Larry Summers, you remember Larry Summers, who was the president of Harvard. Before the article came out, this is the article, I gave the high command at the University of Chicago a copy of the article and the Harvard working paper. And Steve gave the high command at Harvard, meaning the president, the provost, and the deans, a copy of the article and the Harvard working paper, so that they would not be blindsided, because the firestorm would not be simply directed at us, right? All sorts of people in the chain of command would feel the white heat, and they did, of course. But anyway, Larry Summers had seen the piece before it came out, and he saw Steve a day or two later, after Steve gave him the piece, but before the piece was on the internet, and he was very supportive of Steve, very supportive. But he said to Steve, in this one conversation he had with him between the time he got the papers and the time the London Review link was on the internet, he said to Steve, he said, I just don't understand why you did this. He said, you could have been a high-level academic administrator. You could And I anticipated, this is what I'm saying, I anticipated that Steve would not be willing to do it because he would be unwilling to give those things up. Also, by the way, my wife and his wife adamantly opposed us doing this. But anyway, he agreed to do it, and I agreed to do it, and we marched ahead. And, but again, as I told you, by, I'd say August 2005, we had written it off as a failed endeavor, and we just thought it would never see the light of day. But all of this is to say that I don't think that I was anywhere near as brave as Norman Finkelstein and assorted other people who have taken on the lobby for that tenure. I think if you're going to take on the lobby, it makes eminently good sense to have tenure. It makes eminently good sense to do it with someone else. Because if you don't, you could end up getting yourself into a lot of trouble. Now, I'm already in a lot of trouble, so I don't mean that kind of trouble with people calling your names, but just the effect that it has on your psyche could be quite significant. Because they come after you very hard, and they're relentless. And the attacks, to be perfectly frank, are oftentimes quite vicious. Although at a certain point, it loses meaning. I was recently talking to someone who's my last story, who asked me if it bothered me to be called an anti-Semite. I said no, without hesitating. She was actually quite taken aback that I told her so quickly that I was not bothered by being called an anti-Semite. So she said to me, why doesn't it bother you? I said, first of all, I'm not an anti-Semite. I said, Steve is not an anti-Semite. If Adolf Hitler were alive, Steve's wife and 2 children would be put in the death camp, right? The idea that we're anti-Semites is ludicrous. And I said, secondly, anybody who's studied this whole issue of the lobby and how it operates knows that the way they operate is to call anybody who criticizes Israel or criticizes the U.S.-Israeli relationship an anti-Semite. I mean, you get this completely bizarre situation with Norman Finkelstein, whose father was in Auschwitz and whose mother was in Majdanek, right? And they call Norman a Holocaust denier. This is ludicrous. Norman, I know it. He's not a Holocaust denier. His parents were real Holocaust survivors. He lived with that in his house as a boy. And there's a whole literature on the children of Holocaust survivors. And it is not a pretty story. For them to accuse Norman of being an anti-Semite, self-hating Jew, a Holocaust denier, I think that they're wrong. They're disgusting. But you understand at a certain point that it's not true. It's just I hate to use this phrase, but it's sort of the game that they play. And it begins to lose its impact. By the way, Bill Crystal, this is William Crystal, wrote a piece, I can't remember how long ago it was, I think it was probably about a year ago, in the Wall Street Journal. You can Google this. It's called Anti-Judaism. And it's an attack on Steve and me, and some other people as well. But the reason that the piece is entitled Anti-Judaism instead of anti-Semitism is that Crystal, to his credit, says in the piece that the charge anti-Semitism is so overused that it's lost all meaning. So instead of accusing us of anti-Semitism, he accuses us of anti-Judaism, which of course is, in my opinion, ludicrous. But the problem that you face is, how do you prove you're not an anti-Semite? What do I say? Some of my best friends. Crazy. But anyways, that's the way it works. But that is an excellent question, and we thought long and hard about it, and I think long and hard about it in terms of what kind of future research I do on this